Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome, a warm welcome to our panelists today, who I'll introduce in a moment, and also to our online audience. This is for a discussion of COVID in South Asia and its impacts on poor and vulnerable people, and the policy implications that we can draw from the discussion. And we have an expert panel today, who you can see on your screen. We have Imran Mateen, Director of the BRAC University Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh. We have Manjista Banerjee, a researcher at the Indian National Council for Applied Economic Research. We have Marta Eichsteller from University College Dublin, a lecturer, and she's a research associate at ODI. And we have Ihsanallah Ghafoor from the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. We also have Vidya Diwakar, who, although she's not going to make any sort of presentation, will be there to comment and also to summarize the discussion at the end. Now, I'd just like to say a little bit about how the event will unfold. I will ask the contributors 2 rounds of questions. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. Now, if you would like to put a question or a comment or an observation or a thought, please do this as we go along. And these will be sent through to me, and I will be able to transmit these questions and issues to the panelists, who will then be asked to respond. And at the end, Vidya will sum up. This event will last for an hour. So I'd like to go straight away to the first round of questions. And there are 4 questions in the first round, which panelists are going to respond to. First of all, I'd like them all to say something very briefly about the evidence which they have. And then to outline from this evidence, what are the major risks that poor and vulnerable people have been facing during the pandemic? And perhaps, what are the major risks faced by different groups among poor and vulnerable people? And then thirdly, a question for everyone. I think it's a really important question. Do you think that the newly poor will be able to recover their pre-pandemic positions? So I think in many situations, some people who have not been experiencing poverty have become poor as a result of the pandemic. So I think their recovery is an important issue, and we should focus on it. And then a question finally for the first round about the responses that governments have made to these situations. Which of the responses have had positive effects for poor and vulnerable people? Where has there been no or an inadequate policy response, and what might be done about this? And without further ado, I'm going to turn to Imran Mateen to talk about Bangladesh. Imran, over to you.
Great. Am I audible? I hope I'm audible.
You are, yes.
Hi. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Andrew. So what I'm going to be doing is drawing on the evidence that BIGD has been collecting in partnership with PPRC, another research institution in Bangladesh. And we have been conducting a panel study surveys, actually 4 round of panel surveys, starting right after the COVID hit Bangladesh in March last year, March 2020. I mean, from then on, we've been doing surveys. So there are 4 round of surveys based on which the last one was done in August, September this year. And I will be drawing on that evidence base. So I've got a few slides just to tell the story. So I think the first point that I want to make is there are so the big phase of this crisis, the income shock, has been primarily urban. But the shock for the urban poor has been I think, severe, that there's actually a reversal that we start basically seeing. And here you can see pre-COVID, this is the general pattern of any developing context, where you basically have an urban slum. Average income in urban slum would be generally higher than the rural area, and that's exactly, and that over time should narrow, but in an upward way, not in a downward way. And what we basically see here is that by August 2021, there is a reversal, where urban slum average income is now lower than rural, and even rural average income is lower both than pre-COVID. So this is the first picture, right? So we're basically having a wrong reversal. And it basically started off with the very severe income shock in the first round shock, which is the first in June, February to June. That shock for urban slum has been very severe. That has not recovered and actually worsened over time. The next slide, please. It's also the wrong convergence that we're basically seeing over time. So as you can as you can see, the sort of average income pre-COVID, that's February 2020, between different poverty groups, that's the distribution that was there. Quite high up on average for non-poor, and then quite a big gap between non-poor and vulnerable non-poor, as one expects, and then the gap kind of between vulnerable non-poor, moderate poor, extreme poor are sort of clustered together. What you see over time is all of this has basically clustered together in the wrong kind of a way. You have a wrong convergence, and this convergence is primarily driven by the vulnerable non-poor and the non-poor both having the income shock and not being able to recover. And I think that is the other point it's a reality that we need to keep in mind that's happening. The next slide, please. And we also see a widening gender gap. And this is looking at respondents who were employed pre-COVID and looking at their employment status over time. And this is looking at August. So these are, respondents who were employed pre-COVID. And we basically see that of those who were, the 2 points. So one is there's a big transition in job that is happening, right? So you basically, you see that, overall, almost half of 43% of sort of people actually transition from whatever job they were doing. And this transition is a downward transition. It's a transition towards more vulnerable forms of employment. And what's happening is for women in particular, you see that for women compared to men, the ability to transition into new job is much lower. So being out of work has been the predominant response, and for women, it's been much more difficult to get back to work. So whereas over time, only 7% who were employed in February have remained out of work in August, among women, it's 43%, according to our survey results. So that's the widening gender gap. Next slide, please. And we see reverse migration happening, right? And it seems to be a bit sticky. So this is like, over time, 28% of our sample from urban slum area migrated to rural areas. And most of this migration have been due to the urban shocks that we basically saw, income shocks, lack of income opportunities in urban areas because of, the immediate COVID effect. But also, which I did not bring here, is the increase in the non-food expenditure burden, huge expenditure, non-food expenditure burden, which underlies a governance failure, which led to, rise in rent and utilities and education costs and so on and so forth. And 10% remain to be in the rural areas. So there's a stickiness that we start observing, and that's also important to note. Next slide, please. we try to look at do a national estimation of new poor. So new poor we have defined as vulnerable non-poor. Those who are vulnerable non-poor, basically those who are above the poverty line but below the median income in Bangladesh, the national median income. So that population group, and we looked at what percentage of that population group has fallen into poverty, and then blew that up at the national level. So we basically see by August, 19.5% is new poor who were not poor before. The vulnerable non-poor are basically moving into poverty. This does not include the non-poor, because our argument was that non-poor who have fallen into poverty will most likely be more capable of bouncing back, whereas for vulnerable non-poor, the vulnerability is likely to be more sticky. So this is a more of a conservative estimate of the new poor, if you like. Some of the World Bank estimates are actually, sort of a bit more, bigger. They come with bigger numbers on this. Next slide, please. Now, this is what we basically, so because we have panel data, we can look at chronicity, right? We can look at over 18 months, of the vulnerable non-poor who have fallen into poverty, how many of them, what is their distribution in terms of chronicity? And, this is what we basically find, that in total, we basically 35% have been poor over the three rounds, because they were non-poor before. So the first round, of course, they were non-poor. We did 4 surveys. So of the 3 rounds, we basically observed these households 35% to remain under the poverty line. 56% have been kind of, churning, right? Moving in and out. Out of the 3 rounds, they've been maybe, 1 round they've been out, maybe 2 rounds they've been in, and so on and so forth. So that's the churning group. And then 8%, were never poor. Even during the shock. And you can see the urban slum point here as well. The chronicity of the new poverty trap, if you like, and kind of the emergence of a new poverty trap is more urban. And that's very, very clear here. Next slide, please. And we also looked at, this is another dimension, we looked at children, we looked at, learning what educational life of children. And we tried to, come up with this estimate a risk of learning loss by constructing, by sort of looking at what children were doing during this time. And if they were not studying at all, if they were studying irregularly, those were clubbed together to look at learning loss. Risk of learning loss. So this is not a direct measure of learning loss, but a risk of learning loss. And here we see that over time, the risk of learning loss has been increasing, particularly among secondary male. That is the category where we see the largest jump between March and August in terms of learning risk of learning loss. And of course, those schools are opening. Schools have opened right now. This learning loss, risk of learning loss, needs to be addressed in terms of some type of remedial supplementary education. Otherwise, this is going to, kind of really lead to dropouts and, kind of real human capital crisis. Next slide, please. I think that's basically it. So I just wanted to, kind of paint, the kind of a few faces of the effect of COVID-19 among the poor and vulnerable in the Bangladesh context. We can come back later with respect to, what does this mean and what type of policy responses can actually work. Thank you.
Let's go straight on to India and Manjista, please.
Sure. If you could start the slideshow, please. Next slide. Yeah, so I would like to start by just taking a moment to acknowledge my team members who were part of the project as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so for this talk, I'm essentially drawing on 2 data sources: the Delhi National Capital Region Coronavirus Telephonic Survey, which had around 4 rounds, and qualitative interviews that we did, about 30 in-depth interviews, focus group discussion, a couple of focus group discussion, and key informant interviews. The sample frame for both the telephonic survey and the qualitative interviews are in turn drawn from an a study that was ongoing at the time the pandemic hit the country, and which is called the Delhi Metropolitan Area Study. So, like the Bangladesh study, we also have a rich panel, but we have not yet analyzed it in depth. For qualitative interviews, the focus was on households that were economically and socially marginalized, the backward caste, those who are engaged in daily casual labor, those with petty business, and so on and so forth. I would also like to highlight here that the area of the study is the Delhi Metropolitan Area Study, also called colloquially as the Delhi National Capital Region. So the findings pertain to this region alone and is not necessarily representative nationally. Next slide, please. It is not at all surprising, given that India had one of the most strictest lockdown, that livelihood distress is a common concern among the households that we surveyed. So between April to December 2020, about 36% of the households reported that either the salary or daily wages of household members was reduced. The other major concern was inability to find work, with transportation emerging as one of the most important reason for not being able to find work. Household members also reported loss of job. Um, there is an equally high, a substantial proportion of the households who reported loss in business income, or businesses getting or closing down of business. Households also reported selling crops at lower prices. A slightly smaller proportion of households said that they were unable to find work because of familial responsibilities. Next slide, please. So, in the qualitative interviews, this is a kind of typical scenario that respondent told us. This is by an adult male, about 35 years of age, who has 5 household members, and he is the head of the household. He said to us the following: prior to the pandemic, I could engage in labor work of any type from time to time. But wage work got suspended completely during the pandemic, as people were afraid of engaging laborers out of fear of getting infected with COVID 19. Additionally, I used to buy vegetables from wholesale vegetable market and sell within the village. But villagers were apprehensive of buying vegetables from me, as I roamed around from door to door and customers would touch the vegetables before buying. I restarted my vegetable business 2 months back, but over the last month, I have not been able to sell anything. Since then, he told us that he, along with his wife, have found employment in agriculture as agricultural laborers, and incidentally, in this particular instance, they were both receiving the same wage. Next slide, please. So it's not again surprising that with livelihood distress, borrowing is one of the most important coping mechanism. About 44 of the households that were surveyed during June 2020 and December 2020 reported borrowing as a means to cope with their earning deficiency and loss of livelihood. In this and in almost all the qualitative interviews that we did, households reported. Sorry. Yeah. And in almost all the qualitative interviews that we did, households reported borrowing to bridge their income expenditure gap. Again, in this particular instance, where a respondent had her own flower selling shop outside the temple, and which were closed during the pandemic as a containment measure, said that for the past 2 years we are living only on borrowed money. Next slide, please. Reduction in food intake is also one thing that we observed in our both in our surveys and in our qualitative interviews. And the reduction is not so much in terms of skipping of meals as in shift to inferior food items, and reduction in the intake of vegetables, fruits, eggs, fish, or meat. Here are some of the responses that we got during our qualitative interviews. Forget about food. Sometimes we sit, even for tea, because earnings are not enough. Wheat and rice are available from ration, so that at least takes care of roti. This another quote is from a 33 years old respondent whose husband lost his livelihood during the pandemic. We did not make sabzi, just made rotis. We had rotis as it is, with pickles, salt with rotis. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at differences by occupation groups, we find that the markers of distress are higher for casual wage work group or those who are engaged in petty business as compared to either salaried workers or those with agricultural means of livelihood. This holds true both for borrowing as a means to sustain their consumption expenses as also for hunger. Next slide, please. Differences by social groups are also not are also along expected lines. Muslim households were more vulnerable than Hindu households, as well as the scheduled caste households. They were more vulnerable than general and OBC households. This holds true both. Again, this holds true both for borrowing and for hunger. Next slide, please. Okay, now one of the consequences of this financial constraints that people have been facing is that it has reduced the extent to which they can support their children for education. And withdrawal of children from school, particularly private schools, has been one of the most common response to deal with the livelihood crisis. So again, to quote one of our respondents, my children are not going to school this year because we have not given them anything. That is, they could not pay the fees. Last year, when schools were open, they asked for fees for the full year, even though they were open only for 3 months. We did not pay because we did not have money. Children have not been going to school since the first national lockdown, and this would be around March 2020. Next slide, please. Now, if we compare, and this I think is kind of similar to what we find in Bangladesh, is that we find that the urban poor have been more disadvantaged than rural poor, and there are a number of reasons for this. The first is that the disease burden has been greater in urban areas than in rural areas. The lockdown and the containment measures was also more strictly imposed in urban than rural areas. Historically, a greater proportion of India's poor were located in rural areas. Therefore, all our social security measures are directed to rural areas. And that's one reason why the rural poor were better able to better covered through these social security measures than the urban poor. And lastly, but not the least, the agricultural sector escaped relatively undented by the crisis as compared to other sectors of the economy. Second, I would also like to highlight that children of poor parents with limited education are the ones without access to digital devices, and they are the ones who are likely to bear the fallout of a long period of school closure most as compared to other groups of children. Next slide, please. In terms of government response, we have seen support in terms of food grain as well as in terms of cash support. And if we, next slide, please. And here you can see that what I said earlier was that the rural poor have been better able to access these benefits as compared to the urban areas. And next slide, please. And we find that because of the greater vulnerability of Muslim households as compared to Hindu households, and for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe household as compared to other caste groups, they are also the ones who reported a greater share of these food and cash support as compared to other households. That's it for now. I can discuss more about what worked and what did not work later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mangista. And let's go on to Afghanistan. Marta, would you like to contribute?
Okay, so what we did with the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, as well as with Chronic Poverty Network and ODI, is we actually just conducted a study. We are in a very, very early stage of preliminary kind of analysis. Therefore, we don't really have a kind of fully developed analysis just yet. So we decided to kind of share with you a little bit more of what we see on the ground. We did conduct the study itself is quantitative and qualitative together. So we did approximately 70 qualitative interviews, which are divided by knowledgeable interviews, as well as kind of sentinel household interviews. This study in particular is very valuable because it combines the data set from 2015 and 2021. So we kind of have this kind of longitudinal kind of outlook on what's happening on the ground with the household, which has been interviewed before and kind of now, as well as we planning to go and conduct the kind of more longitudinal qualitative analysis, but that is yet to be done. So we don't have that part of the study done yet. So what we see on the ground right now is obviously, considering what's happening is kind of with the conflict and transition of the power and instability, is a big level, it's kind of detrimental level of impoverishment across, and it is much different situation compared with what's happening in Bangladesh and India. So what we see is kind of big nexus of the big macro level issues happening. So it's COVID, the kind of transition of the power associated with kind of Taliban kind of taking over, and the climate change, which affects the kind of agricultural part of the kind of economy. And we see that these macro level issues are not only kind of taking part next to each other, but kind of almost kind of taking part and kind of mixing with each other. So they kind of interacting with each other in this very unexpected way. So we see that, for example, in a kind of waterways and the kind of irrigation way, when the dams are kind of trying to make sure that the agriculture is is being managed in a quite good way. So we've seen that, when the in the agriculture policies, we've seen that, in order to make sure that the water systems have been put together in order for the agriculture to work well, it was all working very, very well over time. But right now, what's happening is after transition of power and Taliban's taking over, the dam system or management of dams have been kind of disrupted, and the water has been released later on in time, and that disrupted the whole agricultural process lower in the kind of system, and because of that, the whole agricultural process has been disrupted, and the crops have been kind of failing. Or we see the situations when the agriculture kind of, the crops have failed. That causes the migrations from the agricultural parts of the country to the cities, which then has been hit by the COVID wave in the cities, and kind of disrupts the kind of health service within the cities. So we can see those synergies between those three macro level issues that actually hit Afghanistan much harder than we would kind of, feel that we would see if we just look at climate change, conflict, and the kind of COVID separately in a way. And we also see on the second level of that kind of synergies, we see that inflation and rising prices, especially of agricultural kind of produce and food, it's hitting Afghanistan and household level and poor people quite a lot. And that is due to the disruption of supply chains of food, and disruption of the production of food, and the disruption of the distribution chains. And once again, the disruption of the supply chain is caused by conflict, and we see a huge huge kind of rises of crime on a kind of supply chain. We have quite a lot of evidence when farmers are talking about that even though they have a produce, it's very difficult to deliver it safely and to distribute it. We have quite a lot of evidence on the disruption of production, where kind of it is very difficult to gather produce on time and or kind of even grow it on time. And we have quite a lot of evidence on the disruption of distribution, where due to the COVID kind of lockdowns, it is very difficult to sell it because the markets are being closed or only open in specific days, and the produce is getting spoiled in between. We also see quite a lot of household level crisis that drains resources, such as we see the rises in a bride price, which kind of drains a lot of resources in terms of, people trying to start families. And, we see quite a, kind of big conflicts in this kind of ideas of, how much the young brides are kind of being, what's the, exchange rates, and, that kind of becomes quite a big and contagious issues. We also see the kind of big issue in medical expenses, and not only in the COVID-related issues, but any other issues. So, the common diseases, kind of cardiovascular, any other, it's becoming quite a drain on the resources right now, as the kind of medical and health systems are becoming pretty kind of jaded. And the same comes with the cost associated with funeral expenses. So as we become, as the kind of situation and the whole system is becoming pretty strained, we see that this is becoming a quite a tense situation, which creates a kind of a situation which really drains the households on the ground and leads those households, to the, very fast to the situation when even the households which has been relatively strong in 2015, right now impoverished in a very, very fast rate. And we actually identified from the households which been in really good financial conditions, very, very few are actually able to withstand that kind of level of drain of the resources, right now. We also see that, the usual ways of coping strategies, which are kind of the access to the credit, which normally would be based on a social capital from the family members, from the community members, from the neighborhoods, is also draining out. Those kind of pockets of money within the kind of social circles are also draining out very, very fast. So this is actually kind of also being taken away from those communities. We also see that, the migration as a kind of route of accessing the money and the capital is being also kind of locked in, mostly because the borders to, the usual route that we've seen was the migration to Iran is also being kind of taken away due to the movement restrictions. There was quite a lot of stories when people actually did take that route. It was quite risky. People have been detained on the border, sent back due to the kind of COVID lockdowns restrictions. So that is also being taken away of them. That situation also created few more at-risk groups, which I hope that Ishan can talk about a little bit more if he's still there. So we've seen on the ground from the qualitative material that situation, exacerbated by this kind of transition of power, just created a very, very unstable and very, very difficult situation for the household, especially at-risk poor household, to really kind of stay, kind of resist the kind of impoverishment as we see it on the ground. I'm not sure, is Ishan there? Can he comment a little bit more?
Thank you, Marta. I think Ihsan is indeed there. And Ihsan, the floor is yours to add to what Marta has said.
Thank you, Marta, for a detailed information provided about this. I'm not going as in detail. You have been already there. Like you talk about the risk groups that are available and about the risk that is like facing to the people in during the data collection. A group of our respondents, they were like facing a group of risk that was like not only the pandemic, but in the time of the pandemic, they also faced the severe drought in the region, and they were not able to cultivate their harvest and their crops. In those farmers who cultivated to some extent, heavy flooded hit their crops, and they destroyed their crops in one of the villages. In the same way, like uh, in the time, like there was also fight in those rural areas in one of our target district, and because of this fight, the people cannot properly had access to the market, and they were not able to sell their products, not only the crops but also the
I think we've
Yeah.
lost Roxanne for a time. Did you want to just carry on a little bit?
Yeah, the other at-risk groups which are being created there are the internally displaced people who are kind of pushed out of the rural areas due to this, agricultural crisis, with lack of the employment due to the failure of the agriculture within that areas, and pushed into the cities and creating this kind of very, very displaced population, kind of inhabited this kind of not urban areas, but this kind of semi-urban, peri-urban areas, very much squatting in without access to education and without access to the health services, creating a kind of very, very at-risk populations. We see the appearance of the kind of child labor appearing slightly with the populations which are kind of depending on the child labor, children actually collecting plastic and paper and scrap in order to help their parents to provide for income for the family, mostly because parents are not able to access the wage labor or secure enough wage labor to provide for the food in terms of rising prices in the city of food, kind of in the cities. And at the same time, because they are not registered in the cities, they don't have an access to the education services as well. Isan, is your connection good?
Yeah, I think it's good. And also, like the illegal migration was also another like people were another risk for the people, because of the drought, because of the fight, because of the COVID-19 and loss of their resources. Some of the household obliged to take the risk of illegal migration, and this illegal migration put them in a big risk, because first they didn't have resources to go for the illegal migration. But what they have done, they took informal credit, or they give their land on mortgage to find the resources to send their family member to Iran or other countries. Because of the heavy, the border was very tightly closed by the Iranian government, and they were not able to cross the border, but they lost their resources. Like in terms of like the risk they are affected the people, because there was no food, no enough food for the consumption. They didn't have eat a lot, because there was no work for them. They didn't have income, so they cannot have enough food. And also, like those children and those women who were like displaced people, they displaced because of the drought, because of the flooding, because of the fight. They didn't have access to education, they didn't have access to school, to health services, like the household number, like one IDP with 2 and 3, and as well as some of the female, because some of the female in some of the household, they were like they had a sort of income from the schools. Since the pandemic, in the like in the time of the lockdown, the government closed the schools, so they also lost that access, and they didn't have income because they were like on contract based teachers. And also the daily wage labor, those IDPs and displaced people, they couldn't have even at the village level, they couldn't have access to the daily wage labor, particularly those people who were working in the street sector. On the other hand, people who were working in the agriculture sector, to some extent they had like access to daily wage labor, but not to a lot, for many days. The other problem which they faced, the risk they affected the people and the rural, was like people, they didn't have access to the market, because most of the time in the at the rural, people have different crops, different like gardens. They have to sell their yield to the local market. But in the time of the lockdown, and the government did not allow them to go and sell their harvest, that also rapidly decreased their revenue in their income. And at the same time, very remote areas, they also lack access to health services, because of there was no enough capacity for the people, and they cannot go to the city, and the government was not able to reach those people to provide health services. In terms of these put these rural people in a very difficult situation, and the recovery for them was very a difficult, and to some extent it was a lot also impossible, particularly to those families who lost their fixed asset, like they sold their livestock, they sold their land, or they give their garden on mortgage. The recovery from these things, it will be very difficult for them. And coming to the response from the government, in the initial state, there was no proper response from the government to these people and to overcome these obstacles. However, because international community and also some donor also provided some aid and food to the Afghan government, and they distributed some these food to the people, but it was not sufficient. In only very in a village 10 to 15 people, they were able to have this aid. And the other major challenge was that the government, there was lack of information. The doctors and those people who were working in the COVID, and those providing health services, they didn't know properly about the way of transmitting these COVID to other people. So there was lack of information among the health and medical people. So I think you can get more about these issues in our in upcoming paper. So I would stop here. If Marta would like to add something.
Thank you, Ihsan, and thank you, Marta. I'm going to just move the discussion on a little bit, as we've taken quite a bit of people's time. I would just like to ask Imran and perhaps Mangista to say a little bit more about the government responses in Bangladesh and in India. I think we've heard just now about Afghanistan. But if you would like to make a brief comment on government responses, and then I think we should then after Vidya's comment, we should open the floor for questions. So please put your questions online, and they will be fed through to me. I don't see any questions coming through yet, but I'm hopeful that they will. Imran, would you like to say a little bit about government responses?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. I think so. The government response with respect to the government responded very early with stimulus packages, but I think the focus was much more to support the larger enterprises, and primarily the RMG sector. I think that worked quite well. I think it was important to do that. But I think the government's response with respect to supporting with more safety net type of packages, I think was not as effective. It was tokenistic. There were challenges in terms of the actual last mile delivery with respect to having proper list and being able to do that listing exercise quickly and being able to harness the kind of power of NGOs and other type of actors to basically do that quickly. I think that's been an area of challenge. The support to the small and medium enterprise, the cottage and small and medium enterprise, which is actually the most a really important sector with respect to employment of the vulnerable non-poor. Primarily, I think support to that sector has actually not been has been announced, but again, I think it's really in the last mile implementation of whatever allocation was basically made that was the biggest challenge, I think. So I think the lesson to draw from here, I think primarily is we need a much stronger focus in terms of last mile delivery. And really understanding what the real challenges there are and how to really, fix the plumbings of the last mile delivery challenge and make that very agile and responsive. I think that is really the takeaway message. No matter what, of course, there's the politics of allocation that needs to be, kind of obviously worked on. But I think the last mile delivery challenge became extremely important, particularly in the urban areas. And I think the point was made from the presentation in India, because in the rural area, at least you have got some form of local government structures, safety net and social protection mechanisms in place, which could be, kind of expanded quickly. It wasn't, but I think in the urban area, the challenge was particularly telling. However, the government, if you look at the, whatever, allocation was basically made, and in terms of delivery, I think there was a focus to try and have a more of an urban focus in terms of the relief response that the government basically did. So I think that's with respect to the safety net and social protection. I think the general policy that was kind of assessment of that. I think in terms of the government has really done well, I think in terms of protecting the agriculture sector, and I think that really is important. Starting from ensuring the cost of input could be kept at some level of control, with ensuring the transportation of the essential deliveries to happen of fertilizer and pesticide and so on and so forth. I think that was prioritized, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. The labor mobility for the harvest that happened during this time. I think the agriculture story is a success story in the Bangladesh context, and I think there's been good policy response on that front. I think the big challenge is really now in terms of the SME sector, how to kind of reinvigorate the SME sector, how to get women back to work, and what type of supportive mechanisms, what was supportive policy should be provided there. And I think this is a big area. And education, I think that is the big one, especially with respect to children coming back to school. Of course, that is very important, but it is in some ways the easier part. The much more difficult part is learning. And here we have an opportunity to shift the focus of education policies and programs from enrollment and sort of just reducing dropout and retention from those type of areas to learning, to more process-oriented indicators and sort of objectives. So I think here we have a big opportunity to basically do that. There are some quite interesting pedagogical innovations that basically happened during this time period using hybrid technology. I think assignment-based, kind of teachers providing assignment and using mobile phone to do the kind of follow-up. I think there is opportunities and promise there that I think should be leveraged further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imran. And I think the education point came out very strongly in the presentation on India. Do we have Manjista still in the event, or perhaps?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay. So in terms of what worked, I think what really worked in India was the Aadhaar-enabled direct benefit transfer system, and the government announced early on, as almost as soon as the lockdown was announced, that it would provide additional grains to all via the public distribution system. This worked well in the rural areas where the casual wage workers and poor households got access to the grains provided. But in urban areas, this was not that well. Did not work that well. In fact, in our qualitative interviews, we come across instances where households were in need of additional grains, but they could not access the PDS system. And also, the other thing that has emerged from our qualitative interviews is that there is a need to enhance the dietary diversity that is provided through the PDS. So that there's not only focus on rice and wheat alone, but there should be, you should also have like you should also provide pulses and other items. Then the cash support, the government also provided some cash support. Again, it was extremely modest. Since then, since these measures were announced, the government has continued with the additional support in terms of food grains till this year's Diwali. But overall, the focus has now shifted to ensuring economic growth, and there is less emphasis on social security measures, safety nets. And the other thing is that in terms of to meet the needs of the urban poor, there is of course a greater recognition of it. You have this talk of one nation, one ration card policy, but again, this can only happen in the long term, and I don't know how it will help the poor immediately. You also mentioned about the learning crisis the country is facing, and I do not think that there is enough policy recognition of it. Schools have reopened, but the approach seems to be learning as usual, which is like teaching according to a grade level fixed curriculum, whereas there has been learning loss. And the focus should be to ensure that children basic concepts and foundations are clear, so that they can understand the curriculum that is appropriate for their grade. Yeah, I guess that's it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manjista. Vidya, do you have any contributions at this point? Any thoughts based on what people have been saying?
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to offer some reflections and also summarize together. And I think we've heard some really interesting insights from our panelists, and I'll take us back to the objectives of this event. The first was around really understanding what has happened for people in and near poverty. And from our different panelists, we've heard that the pathway to zero poverty is facing multiple barriers. To an extent that the progress on poverty reduction that we've seen in some countries before COVID-19 may not so easily occur going forward. So if you think about policies and interventions that otherwise were quite effective in contributing to zero poverty or poverty reduction or eradication, we know, of course, of the importance of quality education, particularly lower secondary school completion. Yet we heard from Imran in Bangladesh, for example, that secondary school-age children, particularly boys, were at a strong risk of long-term learning losses, and also from Manjista in India. I'd be curious to hear as well if this was uniformly across these countries when focusing on people in and near poverty, or how might that situation have been particularly severe the further away you might go, for example, from the capital into areas that may have been particularly historically marginalized and sidelined in countries' development trajectories. We also heard from our panelists that certain combinations, there were synergies. So for example, Marta Nissan noted about the macro challenges around conflict, climate, and COVID, and the impact this really had on blocking livelihood strategies, contributing to displaced populations, forms of household collaboration as well being threatened in the face of, for example, widening gender gaps. But ultimately, these are the factors which are also quite important to household pathways out of poverty. Yes, on the positive side, we've heard that there has been some advances in social protection, but at the same time, we know, of course, of huge aid cuts, which are threatening flows into pro-poor's programming outside of these, largely outside of social protection. And we know, of course, that there are multiple shocks and stressors as well, with coping strategies being blocked during the context of COVID-19. But at the same time, the question then arises as to how we can attribute the impacts to COVID-19 or distinguish it from the other existing shocks and stressors that have been occurring across these contexts. And finally, our second objective of today's session was to understand what can the international community and South Asian governments in particular do to ensure that they can build forward better. And in fact, a lot of the risks and solutions that we've been hearing today are, in my mind, a lot of them are applicable to geographies outside of South Asia as well. So my question then would be, are there any South Asian specific policies and programs that we need to be considering in particular? What can these countries be learning from each other in the responses? I would like each of our panelists, if time allows, to ponder this, to understand in more detail what are the lessons that can be learned across these country contexts in order to make growth pathways going forward truly inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidya. And we do have one or two questions coming in from the audience. So there's a question or set of questions for Imran about migration and asking whether perhaps because, and this would apply in India as well, perhaps because the rural areas may have had a slightly better time in terms of their economic activities compared to the urban areas. You know, has this process of reverse migration been well absorbed, if you like? So if you could say something about that.
Yeah.
And a second question also for Imran, but I think others might also have views on it. What are the major hindrances for women to get back to work, even if things are getting back to normal? We've seen a number of you talking about increased gender inequality in employment. So I think those two questions are very relevant, and do keep the questions coming, audience.
Right. No, in terms of the migration, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of the pattern, what we see is very early on, you know, right when the first lockdown happened, you know, the first, you know, when there was fear factor was very strong and all that. I mean, that's when the large migration, the large, you know, kind of part of the urban to rural migration basically happened. And I think, you know, during the time when recovery was happening, you know, about half of them, I said 28% of urban sample migrated, about, you know, half of them returned, about 10% stayed back. I mean, I think we will be doing further analysis to look at, you know, how they are different of those who are returned and who sort of stayed on, but in terms of how they're being absorbed into the rural economy, I think the big challenge there is that you know, the existing safety net programs or support programs, social protection type of programs that exist in the rural area are not catered to supporting the new poor. They're actually not even part of these, you know, of these lists that through which, you know, these type of support mechanisms actually work. So I think so that's sort of one. And second is, you know, their political connections and political social capital in the rural area is weaker compared to you know, people who live in rural areas for a longer time period. So that is another, I think, issue. So and the third one is, you know, these are vulnerable non-poor. These are actually not you know, sort of long-term poor people. So the aspirational dimension, the psychological dimension, I think is also important. The skill sets are also quite different. Those who are basically staying back in the rural areas. So I think you know, the support package here, I think needs to take those elements into consideration. And you know, it may not require a lot of grant-based support, but a support that basically allows access to capital for them to be able to start maybe enterprises. So this is more of a micro enterprise development oriented support rather than safety net type or sort of social assistance over the longer term. So I think that's the way to basically think about this. The question around what are the barriers for women getting back to work, I think this is something that I think we need to understand much more. But I think what's really happening, so one is the sectors in which this women's employment, some of the sectors have been more affected than the sectors where male are predominantly working. So for instance, beauty parlor, tailoring, those type of sectors have been more affected due to sort of COVID. So I think, and it's taking longer for them to recover, and because this is linked up with the aggregate demand of the economy and so on and so forth. So I think there's a sectoral dimension here. So there's we need to think about other types of employment opportunities that may kind of in the interim could basically work, or maybe completely moving away from some of those sectors where perhaps the sort of demand pickup here would not actually basically happen, at least in the medium term. But I think there are real constraints with respect to intra-household. So because as men's income have basically fallen, so I think there are intra-household labor allocation that's basically happening where women are, picking up some, kind of household level work, which perhaps was done sort of before with a higher level of income, employing, household help and so on and so forth. I think that perhaps may be part of the story. So I think there are intra-household dynamics, and I think sectoral labor, labor issues that I think needs to be looked at, and any package needs to, any active labor market, kind of policy or intervention needs to look at both intra-household and the sectoral dimensions of women's income, work dimensions.
I think that's a very strong response. Thank you, Imran. And there's also a question for Manjista. Coming out of your presentation, what are the specific factors contributing to certain communities like scheduled castes and Muslims worsened situation in comparison to others? I mean, this could lead to a very long answer, Manjista, but did you, because clearly, this is a very deep set of issues in India, but did you come across any kind of short answers in your work to that? You're muted, Manjista.
I think it has to do with a number of factors. One is that the nature of work that they are involved in is almost always very contact intensive, and that is one reason why they have been more affected than other communities. Also, the overall level of skills that some of them have is extremely low, and they're also engaged in informal employment. So these, I mean, to give a very short answers, these are the kind of factors that push them out of the that make them particularly vulnerable. For example, I highlighted this case during the presentation. This scheduled caste woman, she had a flower shop in front of the temples, and temples were closed due to the pandemic. And one of the rumors that spread was that COVID spreads through flowers, and that became one additional reason for people not engaging in business with her. And the other example was that of vegetable vendor who said that people were apprehensive of buying vegetables from him because people would be touching the vegetables before they would buy. So this kind of a contact intensive nature of their work makes them particularly vulnerable. And also, when it comes to Muslims, I think the government did not handle the situation, and in fact it precipitated a crisis for them, where they were seen as active spreaders of the virus. And this promoted this, this did not come up so much in the interviews that we did, but but it was possibly one of the reasons why they were more vulnerable than the other communities. I'm giving a very short answer.
Thank you very much, Manjista. That was admirably short for such issues. I have a question here. Are there any learnings from the experience for Pakistan? But I think this relates to Vidya's challenge to the presenters. Can we learn any lessons from the experiences which are applicable in other countries, either from the experiences of policy interventions or program interventions? But can we learn anything from these experiences which can be more widely applied? Let me start with Afghanistan, which I think is perhaps the most challenging of the environments. If either Ihsan or Marta would like to respond on that, is there any learning? And then we'll go to India and Bangladesh, and then we'll have to wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, from my perspective, I would be interested to know comparatively, how you can see very strongly when you compare with Bangladesh, when agriculture is managed well in a context of crisis versus when it's not managed at all. When you see, the kind of complete collapse, how with the, how the outcomes can be completely different. And, how lessons can be learned, how to handle those kind of transitions moments really, really successfully. I think, for the policy perspective, this is really interesting way of seeing how it can kind of, how you can, really kind of supervise that kind of transitions and crisis and make sure that, the really, really sensitive moments are being kind of secured really well and cushioned really well. So, this is comparatively really, really brilliant opportunity to do that kind of comparative for me as a kind of comparative researcher. But, in some, any other?
First, I would like to add some about the hindrances for the women in Afghanistan, like whether do they went back to their jobs or not. I think from like we have a couple of hindrances for them. Like first, the first reason was that women are not able to go back to their own jobs. Like it was the change in the government. In the strategy for the new government is like they are allowing. They are saying that they would allow to go to women to go back their own, but within the frame. But so far they didn't go back. The other reason in the previous regime, like on that time, the lack of funding was like another opportunity, because during the COVID there was no enough funding, in the international community also stopped. Some of the international like organizations stopped their works, and women lost their jobs. And when the lockdown COVID was not finished, then the regime has changed. And the other two reasons that we had like women who had income generation activities, those women were severely have affected, as Imran also said, like in the sector wise. We had women who was producing the local markets, but since the markets closed and they lost their market and they lost their customers, they didn't have they were not able to go to gain those customer back, or to gain the position in the market. So these were like some hindrances for the women. In terms of comparison, I think there was like there are a lot of issues that could comparatively, because like we can say the migration compared to Afghanistan and Pakistan, compared to Pakistan, Afghanistan, there's more migration of the people due to COVID, due to drought, fight, and this change of this government. So this is the only one issue that Afghanistan has more. Thank you. I think you are muted, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Manjista, would you like to comment from an Indian perspective? And you are muted too, Manjista.
Yeah, I also see a question on the digital distance in rural, and can I respond to that briefly?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so this has been a major cause of concern. I mean, online teaching for those in rural and tribal rural India is essentially means, what a respondent told me was that it means that that the teacher is essentially is nominal. He said it's just nominal. It means that the teacher is sending pictures from the text, and the child has to complete the assigned homework and send it back. So it was not actual teaching it was not teaching in any real sense. One of the ways to resolve this could be that you have digital libraries in villages where people can take some digital devices, they can group among themselves, and then there can be some kind of real online teaching happening. As of now, it is not. Yeah, even when they say there is online teaching, it actually means that there is not much that is happening. And I think that there is possibilities of learnings here from Bangladesh, because they have had of hybrid teaching models, and I think this is where a lot of learning can take place between the two countries.
Thank you very much, Mangista. Imran, would you like to follow that?
Thank you. So two. I think one is what Mangista just now mentioned. I think there are big opportunities and risks as well with respect to the edtech promise here. I think both India and Bangladesh, we have huge markets, obviously and there's a big demand for education among our population. So there's obviously a lot of interest in terms of edtech innovations from around the world, and COVID has really opened that space up in a much more in a much more intensive way. But I think we need to have we need to grab hold of this opportunity so it works for our children, rather than being used as a way to privatize and sort of serve certain commercial interests. So I think there's a big danger here and a huge opportunity as well. So it's a high stake opportunity here, and I think coalition building is going to be really important on this front. So this is sort of one. The other is, I think there is an emergence. We start seeing this emergence of trap here. So we are seeing emergence of poverty trap that is happening, and we know there are very strong evidence-based interventions that can work to unlock such traps. The ultra poor graduation model that BRAC in Bangladesh has been pioneering, and there's huge amount of evidence that it's very effective in multiple contexts around the world. So I think there's an opportunity as well to really bring forth these type of evidence-based interventions that we know works, and how to really mainstream these as a part of COVID recovery, social protection, and jobs strategy. I think that's another, big area that we could all work on. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, we've had a very interesting discussion today. We've run a little bit over time, but I thought that it was better to keep the discussion going until we reached a point where we had satisfied hopefully most of the audience. I don't think there are any more questions coming in now, but I would just like to thank all the panelists. You prepared some very substantial material for us today, and you've responded very nicely to the issues that I've raised and the issues raised online by the audience. Thanks to our audience as well for raising those issues and for listening. And please do communicate with us afterwards if you would like to. We're very open to that. And thanks also to the team behind the scenes. That's Rob and David and Isadora for making the session run pretty smoothly, despite the challenges of the internet. Thank you all very much. I'm closing this now, and wish you a very good day, afternoon, evening, as it is.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.